The peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are underway. The meeting is taking place on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. Ukraine has called for immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of the Russian troops as the country's delegation arrived for the talks with Russia. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is not a part of the delegation. But it is a high-level delegation involving the Minister of Defense, the advisor to the President of Ukraine and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Zelenskyy himself on Sunday set low the expectations for the meeting, but said that it was worth a try.
Скажу відверто, як завжди, я не дуже вірю в результат цієї.
I will say frankly, as always, I do not really believe in the outcome of this meeting, but let them try. So that no citizen of Ukraine would have any doubt that I, as president, did not try to stop the war when there was a small chance.
Коли був нехай і маленький, але все ж таки шанс.
Let's go straight across now to Fred Weir joining us live from Moscow. Thanks very much, Fred, for being here with us. How optimistic are you about these talks and what are your expectations at this point?
I'm not very optimistic at all, but I don't know what is the actual battlefield situation. You know, I sit here and I read dispatches from both sides, and they are as if they're describing events happening in totally different universes, except that the place names are the same. You can't get a sense of what's really going on from what they are saying on either side. And whether or not the expectations of each would be fulfilled depends on that. For instance, the Ukrainians clearly are going into the talks with the demands that Vladimir Zelenskyy did enunciate there. Russians stop fighting and get out. The Russians clearly have come to the talks with the intention of reading terms of surrender to the Ukrainians. These are not reconcilable positions, but, you know, and I'm so sorry to be pointing this out, this gap would be bridged on the battlefield by one or another making decisive headway. And we don't know that now. So we don't know. It is like at least 3 hours that they've been talking, as far as I can tell. So that alone is a hopeful thing, but we must wait and see.
Right. Since you mentioned that, this is an information war of sorts as well, with each side putting out their versions. What is your assessment of the messaging coming in from Moscow so far? Well,
the Russians say they're making headway, that they're executing planned maneuvers, that they don't intend to take cities. They intend to encircle them, to break up and destroy the Ukrainian army, that is to demilitarize Ukraine. That was one of their demands. They say they're making considerable progress in the eastern Ukraine, and they do seem to be maneuvering deep inside Ukraine there. Along the front on the Donbass, they claim major success in moving forward. You know, that was a frozen conflict for almost 8 years, but the Russians and their separatist allies claim to have penetrated dozens of kilometers into the Lugansk and Donetsk regions, which they claim as they are the former Ukrainian oblasts or provinces, whatever you want to call it. They claim those territorial units in their entirety, even though they only occupied about a third of them for the last 8 years. So they claim to be making progress on that front. That some cities have surrendered, small cities in eastern Ukraine have surrendered to the Russians, and we know that. But beyond that, we just don't have much sense of whether the Russian plan is being effectively executed or whether they're starting to run into really big obstacles. And
talking further about the posturing, the Russian president even as those talks and the possibility of them going ahead was doing the rounds, announced that the country's nuclear deterrence forces are being put on high alert. What do you make of these statements and the kind of narrative coming in from Vladimir Putin?
This is a really dangerous form of posturing. And now it isn't something to get, to freak out about at this point. It's just going on alert, putting nuclear weapon systems that are always sitting there on a hair trigger, on a even more instant response kind of basis. But anything like that in a nuclear armed world is terrifying for us. I grew up under the shadow of nuclear war in the Cold War, thought that was never going to come again, and just overnight it has this, this terror has revived. So that's something, and I don't know what it says. It's clearly a warning to the West to stay out of this business in Ukraine, but one worries about the thinking that is going on in the Kremlin, because a week ago, no one, including me, predicted where we are now, and so I'm not confident in any predictions I may make now.
Indeed. Let's talk about the sanctions and the measures that have been taken by the West. Some have been calling it a classic case of too little, too late. Help us understand the impact of those sanctions on the Russian economy and your assessment of whether the West could have done a lot more earlier.
Well, they are serious, and they're serious for average people who have gotten used to traveling to the West, to accessing things with their debit cards in Western products, from email or from online services. See, I personally, my life is just wrecked by this cutting off of banks from SWIFT, because I work for an American newspaper and receive my money from the United States in bank transfers. I am screwed. But average Russians maybe aren't as exposed as a foreign correspondent like me, but still, everybody has some. Russia did integrate to some extent, considerable extent, to the world economy in the past 30 years. And to the extent that that's now being dismembered, it will hit Russians at every level of their lives. I don't think the state will suffer too badly. And even if it did, I think they're so determined to carry out what they've decided upon that no amount of pain would stop them. I think sanctions, they will have catastrophic implications, not only for Russia, but for the West. If they start hitting energy exports and things, Europe is very vulnerable. But I don't think that will change Russian behavior.
Right. So in hindsight, do you think that when those diplomatic efforts were being made, there was a way to deter Russia?
I would put it differently. I think there was a way to sit down and negotiate a new security order in Europe, which, even though Putin has introduced these new demands that are absolutely unacceptable for Ukraine, which basically negate Ukrainian sovereignty, he did indicate before that he was willing, and even in his recent speeches, he singles out NATO expansion as his central concern. And I think a little more creative statecraft in the West to give up the NATO expansion thing, which is a dead letter anyway, in exchange for security guarantees for Russia and also for Ukraine. It might have, it's all arguable, and there's no point in debating it now, but there was a window in recent months for diplomacy, much more active and creative diplomacy, to have struck a bargain with Russia. Right.
If you could talk about the varying moods on the ground, ever since this attack against Ukraine was launched by Russia. We've also been seeing those images of protests that have been taking place in Russia against this attack.
Yes, I think all Russians are really shocked. This is, it isn't even like the United States invading Iraq or something, which was a similar type of total, absolutely crazy, reckless mistake. But Iraq was a faraway place, and Americans didn't know many Iraqis. Most of them probably couldn't find the place on a map. But for Russia, Ukraine is not just next door. It's been historically joined at the hip with Russia for 300 years. Russians all have friends and many have relatives in Ukraine. Until recently, they had a lot of associations, would travel there. This is more like a fratricidal war, and it's deeply disconcerting for Russians. I think the longer it goes on, the more people you will see openly protesting against it. Those who are protesting, by the way, right now are a minority. They're the usual people who show up in the streets, more of them this time. But there are also open letters from professional associations signed by thousands and thousands of people. Even oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska have spoken out against it. This is a new level of public disquiet about this war.
Fred, thanks very much for being here and sharing those perspectives.
My pleasure.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.